Regarding the RC cross-section data, we'll find that we have a set of properties. The first thing is the global cover now is 30. If I enter as 0, we find that my rebar ends up right at the surface of the concrete. Every time I enter a cover value, I find that this cover is applied in all directions around rebar. And the value of 50 that we entered is the cover thickness from the concrete surface to the surface of rebar. We'll find the same thing here as well. The second value we have here, of course we can control the cover for each segment. So right now we have the global cover value, and as we saw, we can change it from the property we have here. We have another value, which is the segment cover. For example, I want the cover for the segment below to be different from the cover of the segment for the rebar legs I have. We can do this from the menu, set segment cover. It starts by showing me below specify offset that it's currently set to 50. So I'll tell it, no, I want it to be 20, for example. Enter, that's it. It will set the cover value here to 20, and it will keep the cover for the other two segments. Of course, if I go back to global cover and set it, for example, to 40 or 50, it will reset all the covers for every segment back to the value I entered. Now, there's another solution I can use to adjust my segment through this grip. When I start to drag this, it tells me what cover value I'm currently at. So now it's telling me I'm at a cover of 50. When I start dragging it, it tells me what cover value I've reached. Of course, I can enter whatever number I want. Let's say, for example, 25. At that point, it will drop to a value of 25 for the segment below. And when we check, we'll find that my cover value here has become 25. So this is another method as well. So now we have 3 ways to enter the covers. For the generic rebar, through the global cover or through the menu. For each segment, I start to set segment cover for each of these segments, either through the blue grips that are present on each of these segments, or I grab this grip and I simply start moving it with the mouse. Or while I'm moving this grip or working with it, I enter the distance I want to apply, whether inward or outward. If we now go to other properties of what we have here, we'll find something called start offset and end offset. If we pay attention, we'll notice that the grip of rebar start grip is anchored in the concrete here and anchored in the concrete here, but the rebar is set at a distance from the surface of the concrete. This is a distance of start offset and end offset. So if we enter start offset value as 0, we'll find that the rebar is anchored right at the surface of my concrete, or coincides with the location of the first grip point I have. The more I enter a distance for this offset here, we see that the length of the rebar from the start begins to decrease. Or if I enter this distance with negative, it starts to extend outward. The same applies here. On the other side, if I go to the end, and as we mentioned when explaining the point location, we'll find that start is the red point or the end is the green point, depending on my drawing method. Also, if I set end offset to 0, it will be anchored at the surface of my concrete. The more I enter, the more it decreases. If I enter a negative value, it comes out beyond the concrete. The next property is cover to rebar center line. The default cover, as we saw, is now 50, so the cover is measured from the surface of the concrete to the surface of the rebar. In another way, I make the cover to center line. If I set the cover to center line to yes, diameter I have is 10. So we find that it immediately refresh cover and sets the cover to 55, because now it always measures the cover value to the center line. If we look, we'll see that the rebar now has the cover as specified. It's measured from the center of the rebar with a value that is the 50 cover for the surface plus 5, which is half the diameter. Of course, this applies in all directions. Now, if I set this global cover to say 70, that means the 70 will be the cover value up to the center of the rebar as well. So in this case, all my work will always be to the center of the rebar. Of course, the normal situation in my drawing is that when I draw the rebar, I find that the rebar is drawn with grips on concrete and the rebar is set inward by the cover value that I entered. So we find that this distance is the cover value we're working with, which in this case is 30. There's another method for drawing. If I come and modify it from the preference or generic rebar settings, from here, we open the generic rebar and change the RC or cross-section data. For example, let's say, I always want to start with a cover of 50 and set as default. So now, when I come to draw the generic rebar again, it will start with a cover of 50 from the beginning, just as we set in our preferences. In the property called Draw Using Centerline, as we saw a little while ago, when we draw the rebar with the cover value that we've entered, and we have this Draw Using Centerline option. If I enable it from my preferences, or even if I come and change the value now, what it does is that it sets the cover value to 0, or it takes the cover value as half the diameter of the rebar, so that the rebar is drawn on centerline. So for example, if I select this rebar and tell it to draw by centerline or use centerline, we'll find that the rebar is positioned with its value as the negative of the cover value. So as we can see, the polyline that I'm drawing the rebar on has become the center of the rebar. And of course, this happens if we change it from the settings of the generic rebar in the preferences. And we go to the RC data. Yes, RC cross-section data, we set use center line. Yes, and we did that. Use as default. This means that now when I draw the generic rebar, it will be drawn with its center aligned. This is useful if I have a polyline on the drawing. And the polyline in the drawing represents the concrete, not the concrete dimension. It now represents the rebar itself. But the rebar is drawn using the polyline, then only drawn the generic rebar. And as soon as I hover over its points, I find that it's exactly as if I drew it on my center line, not on my concrete dimension. Of course, the distance at the beginning and at the end, this is the offset value. If we adjust it, we'll find that now the line or the polyline that was drawn earlier represents the center line of my rebar. In this case, there is no cover, but the cover becomes negative by the value of my diameter, and it won't allow you to add a cover. To be able to add a cover, at that point, you have to change your mode from center line to the standard mode. Then when you try to add a cover, you'll find that the cover is actually applied and the rebar starts to move inward accordingly.